There we go. All right. Thanks for the wait. So, again, thanks for the great intro. My name's Reiter. I am not a founder of Nimbix, where I currently reside. Nimbix is a high-performance computing company, and actually the founders are here today. One of them's here right now. The other one was here earlier. They're great guys. Make sure you talk to them. But I did co-found this company called Virtual Bridges. It was an Austin company that I'll get into, and I was able to take that experience and bring it to Nimbix. And unlike Shaheen recommended, I really did not spend 9 months working on these slides. It was really maybe more like 9 minutes, somewhere in that range. Yeah, maybe. I also didn't rehearse, so you guys are you're in for a treat here, especially right before lunch, so you'll be ready to eat afterwards, I'm sure. And really what I want to say is this is not really about Nimbix, it's not really about virtual bridges, it's actually about me, and should come as no surprise to those who know me, so that's one of my favorite topics. But really it's not about me personally, it's about what I learned and what I can share with you, and I was kind of in a unique situation, and you'll see why. So Virtual Bridges was actually founded in 2006, right here in Austin. You might recognize that kind of impression behind it. That was the view from our office, more or less. And the founders, obviously I'm up there as well, but the one thing that was really interesting about that is that I was the youngest of the four by at least 15 years. So it was a huge generation gap. I was the only Gen Xer on the team, which is kind of interesting. The good news is I actually built the technology, so that was it's always great to be young when you're building software and not trying to sell it. And a funny story is that when I joined the kind of predecessor company to this, and we'll get into the timeline in a minute, but I wasn't actually even old enough to rent a car. And the first time I came to Austin, I had to get like some kind of special exemption because I was only 24 when I joined. So that was kind of an interesting thing, but just before turning 25, I joined the company, the predecessor company. So if you look at the timeline, we had a company called Netraverse that I joined in 2001, and I don't know if you guys, how long you've been around Linux, but we had a product called Win4Lin, which was actually a brand that was well recognized in the early 2000s. It let you run Windows applications on Linux. It was actually pretty popular, and we're proud of that, but that was kind of the genesis of kind of everything we achieved at this company. And of course we got hit by 9/11, pretty much right after I joined. So I like to say, and I've heard the term before, but I think of it as that kicking off the lost decade. And obviously it was bookended by the financial crisis. So that's actually when we were doing business. So you can imagine how interesting it was to try to raise money and fund a company while people were too scared to invest, and then the capital markets were just too tight. So that was kind of what was squeezing us there. So typically startups don't last 13 years, I guess is what I'm getting at. But when you're self-funding and you don't have money, you can kind of go as long as you can. In 2002, we accidentally invented VDI, and that's been independently verified. This crowd may not know what VDI is, but it's virtual desktop infrastructure. So we used to think that people were going to run their Windows desktops on servers and deliver them to thin clients. And then mobile came along and kind of blew that whole thing up, and desktops really don't matter now. But at the time, it was actually really, really hot. So we were trying to compete with terminal services, and we found a better way to do it in the sense that we could run applications with more fidelity and so forth. And lo and behold, we added a connection broker and provisioning engine to our virtualization hypervisor, and we actually had server-hosted virtual desktops 4 years before VMware actually coined the term. So if you know the industry at all, there's a guy named Brian Madden who was kind of a big-time pundit in this industry, and he verified that independently a couple of years ago or 3 years ago. So in 2006, we actually did like a management buyout of the old company, and we founded Virtual Bridges. So I wasn't a founder of Netraverse. I came in, I was hired in, but then I actually co-founded Virtual Bridges. And really, I'm not going to read everything to you, but in 2012, IBM actually added our product to their portfolios, their catalog. So their sales guys were actually outselling our product with the IBM Virtual Desktop brand on it, which is a huge, huge milestone for the company. Unfortunately, it was, the investors were really looking for kind of a faster payout, and when you tie your strategy to IBM, it's like the Titanic, right? I mean, it moves at its own pace, and years of delay to IBM are really like they're just these things just happen, right? So it's not that relevant to them, but to a startup with investors, when you go, even 6 months longer than you should, they start getting impatient, and when you're like 3 years longer, then they get really impatient and things happen. So they basically asked us to kind of bring this product to maturity. And they poked around and tried a few different things, but basically at that point, what I did is I brought the product to maturity, and I actually left the company before, a few months or a couple of years actually before it was shut down. And actually before it was shut down, a company in Austin here called Nimbix, which is a hyper-converged infrastructure solution, actually bought the team and the product and integrated it into their SDDC, software-defined data center portfolio. And that product is still, to my knowledge, still being sold to this day. It's actually on the Nimbix website if you look. So when I left Virtual Bridges, I actually started pitching investors. It was very early on, and I actually met one of the board members of Nimbix, and it turns out my pitch was very synergistic with what Nimbix was trying to do. So he introduced me to the CEO and the founders, and I was able to join Nimbix and kind of complete what was already a really great founding team, but just kind of bring some key pieces of capabilities there. So I'm really, really excited about that. Really loving what we're doing at Nimbix. I'm going to kind of not even read all this stuff, but the main thing that I'm really proud of is that we actually made customers successful. So we didn't have enough customers. Obviously, we'd be talking about something different here, but to this day, as far as I know, the Department of Defense is still using this technology to run Linux virtual desktops and down at Lackland Air Force Base. And the product actually has staying power. Customers love it. It's highly differentiated. It's a lot easier to manage than some of the competing technologies, even though it has not evolved in like 4 years. So that's something that I'm especially proud of, is that we actually help customers realize value and be successful. So I wouldn't call Virtual Bridges a failure, because we did a lot of great things, and actually it did result in a type of exit. But since it wasn't a 9-figure exit, I wouldn't really call it a smashing success either. That was the plan, right? So this is something really interesting that Bill Gates said, and I completely agree with this. You have to, whether it's fail or just not succeed enough, you have to do that before you actually really understand what success is, because you just don't. First of all, the sweet is a lot sweeter when you've tasted the bitter, obviously, but also what you learn from not really hitting it out of the park, you basically learn what to do and what not to do, so you're more successful the next time. So when you're just plain successful the whole time, you just kind of assume that a lot of times that's timing, that's luck, whatever it is talent as well. But you don't learn that much, right? I mean, you just learn that whatever you did was successful. You don't learn, the painful lessons that you can take with you to be even better the next time. So at a very high level, I mean, everybody learns this in every startup if you just kind of have eyes and ears. I mean, that's all you really need to learn this stuff. But obviously, it's all about execution. You've heard people talk about this this morning. Deployment trumps functionality is something my mentor taught me early on, and that is basically like, if customers can't actually deploy your solution, it's worthless. It doesn't matter how good it is. It's got to be something that people can actually use, right? So that's something that as technologists, obviously I'm a technical guy. It's really important that we understand the user is the most important part of our technology, not the technology itself, right? So, and the user has to be able to deploy it and use it and get value out of it. Otherwise, how do they know that it even has value if they can't use it, right? So a lot of times what ends up happening is we build products that are way too complex, try to do too many things, and then are pretty much impossible to use. I mean, look, with all due respect, look no further than OpenStack. Some of the challenges OpenStack is having, right? It's because it's not, there's a lot of capability there and a lot of promise, but it's not succinct enough for somebody to just take and deploy and use, right? So those are some of the things that we need to think about as technologists. So a lot of times it means simplifying our technology to where it can actually be consumed. So instead of being kind of a bucket of features, it's maybe the 3 or 4 features that really matter and a really repeatable way to get it working, right? And that's what really, really drives and sells technology. And don't believe the hype. We heard a lot about hype today. When you're a small company, you're competing with behemoths, they will, it's innovator's dilemma, right? They will do everything they can to try to position their existing stuff that you're disrupting as use cases to solve the same problems you are. If you're actually really disrupting them, they'll try that. The problem is that brings all their baggage with it, and it doesn't. And when you talk to customers, you'll find out that either it doesn't work that well or it's really, really expensive, right? So even though when you look at their marketing, they'll be like, oh yeah, we solved that problem, like that works great. And then when you talk to customers, that's what really matters. Don't believe the marketing hype. when you're in the trenches competing against large companies, talk to customers. That's where the real value, the real understanding of what your competitors are doing actually comes from. Right? So that's enough about the stuff that anybody can learn, right? So now let's think about like maybe some things that I learned that may not be that obvious to everybody, right? So the great philosopher Mario Andretti basically said that if things actually seem under control, then you're just not going fast enough. And he was talking about his Lotus 79, which I find terrifying even in my simulator, so I can't even imagine in the flesh, but it applies to business as well, right? There's also kind of an inverse of this where, when early stage companies, they hire people and some people don't work out, don't have what it takes to stay on. My mentor actually taught me that, the saying he has is sometimes you drive so fast that some people get car sick. And what you're doing in a startup is you're driving really, really fast. And a lot of times you're out of control, or it seems like you're out of control, right? So the solution to that is to just control what you can actually control and don't worry about the rest, right? Because if you're actually controlling these key things, right, then as an individual, I'm not talking about as a company strategy, then everything else, assuming that you have the right team in place and all the things that we've already heard this morning, everything else tends to fall into place. So your health, this is really not like your doctor saying, well, you need to exercise, otherwise you're going to have a heart attack. I mean, that's obviously true, and you need to do that. But it actually makes you smarter. There's plenty of research out there that says if you exercise, the cardiovascular impact of exercise on your brain makes you sharper. So if you're trying to do something that's almost impossible, which is basically run a startup, you want to be as smart as you possibly can. And if it means spend half an hour a day exercising, please do it. It's really not that difficult. The other thing that I found about it, the flip side, is that it gives you time to think and reflect in a way that's rarely do you have the ability to just kind of sit there and reflect, unless you meditate, which of course is fantastic as well. But if you're, think of exercise as a way of open eye meditation, which is what people call yoga, right? But it doesn't have to be yoga. It can be on a treadmill. It can be running. It can be, I box, 4 times a week. What happens is that it's the only time that you can really just kind of sit there and think and just kind of, take in the world and think about yourself, not about what you're doing with your business and all these different things. And it may incorporate some of that, but it's all about you, right? To keep your blood sugar steady, I've personally found that, and there's evidence to suggest it, if your body goes into survival mode because you're suffering from blood sugar spikes, like if you actually survive on sugary drinks and snacks and whatever, at some point your body's going to be like, all right, I need to eat food right now because your blood sugar is doing this. And once your body does that, your brain kind of stops working and just kind of focuses on going to get food. So the best way that I've found to do that is to try to eat things that burn slow. And I'm not a dietitian by any means. I mean, I've got a few pounds to lose. I'm not trying to preach to anyone, but I've personally found that if I'm not starving, like if I'm not in a mode where it's like I have to eat food right now or I'm going to pass out, that I can actually focus on what I'm doing. When I get into that mode of starvation, then I can't. And one of the things that's sure to put you in that mode is sugar and the bad carbohydrates and so forth, right? So try to keep your blood sugar steady and you'll be way more productive. And then one thing that I do is I avoid passive activity. So I'm not, a huge fan of just kind of lounging out when I have spare time or whatever. Your brain atrophies just like anything else, right? So it doesn't mean that you have to be working 24/7, although you will do that as a startup person in general, but just keep yourself, engaged in stuff. So your brain's actually always working, right? And that keeps it fresh for when you need it to really produce. The one thing I'll say that actually my wife asked me to put in here, she's here, is don't let stress break these habits. It's something that unfortunately I did toward the end of Virtual Bridges. Obviously it was a complex time. And it's amazing how the havoc that stress actually wreaks on your body, right? So positive stress is good, but when you start getting into negative stress and so forth, I mean, you'll put on pounds like you've never seen before. You'll just, you won't be able to breathe. There's all kinds of, I wasn't sleeping for several weeks at one point. So try to wrestle that back as soon as you can if you get into a situation like that, because really, this is the best investment that you can make is your own health, right? So there, I quoted myself. I told you it's about me, but this is kind of like time heals all wounds, but what I found is even more important to explain is that yes, unless it's actually time that's a wound, So if you waste time, you don't get that back ever. You can ruin your reputation completely, right? You can rebuild that. You can ruin your, like in personal life, you can ruin your credit, you can rebuild that. Why? It takes time, right? I mean, time made the universe. You know, take hydrogen and energy, time over 14 billion years made us, right? But it doesn't actually get you your time back. And when you're trying to compete and you're trying to build products and win in the marketplace, your biggest enemy is time, because that's the one advantage you have over larger companies, is being able to out-hustle them, right? So you need to find a way to not waste time. Yes, sir? Oh, time, 5 minutes. All right. So anyway, the main thing here is to manage expectations. So if you actually, tell people realistically and set expectations for yourself and for your customers or whatever, everything else just kind of falls out of that. So there's no reason to try to impress people with unrealistic stuff. I mean, that doesn't work, right? So you need to make sure that you're being realistic about what you can deliver. So that's one way to control your time. You guys have seen this Einstein quote, so I don't need to read it. But basically your message, you've heard tons of people talk about this today. The biggest thing, two things for me is, number one, what problem are you solving? If you're building cloud software and your answer to what problem are you solving is I'm solving cloud, that's not a problem, right? The problem is, well, why? Oh, self-service. Okay, that's also not a problem. That's a solution, right? So make sure you everybody on your team, we've heard this before, everybody has to understand these basic messaging things. And then the one thing I found that helps, especially in the sales process, is be black and white whenever possible. If your message is too nuanced or your value is too nuanced, it's really hard to sell and for customers to understand. All right, so here's three things that I really, personal skills that I really learned as a founder. One is how to lead. What you want to do is create more leaders as a leader, right? You don't want people to just kind of do your bidding or apprentices or whatever. You want people to become leaders themselves, to inspire, empower, and hold them accountable. You want to invite fresh ideas, so you want to empower. One thing I do is I actually, with new hires, I actually empower them to challenge my assumptions. To say, you know what, you're coming in fresh as a software architect or whatever, look at our architecture and just kind of analyze it and tell me what's wrong with it. And it may or may not be valid, but it helps them learn, and it helps you kind of hear a fresh voice who's qualified because you brought them on board. Tell you what, maybe something that you haven't been thinking about, right? And don't forget about incentive. It helps to actually incentivize people, equity, bonuses, etc. I use MBOs. I'm not going to tell you what that is. Look it up. Founders have tremendous influence. Always lead by example. The other thing I learned is how to hustle. And the main thing here is to actually own whatever you're doing. So if you actually own something, you make sure it's done right. And if you have time pressure, you make sure it's done fast, right? If you're just looking at everything you need to do as a series of tasks, then you're just kind of checking a box. But if you look at problems, say I need to own this to completion and make sure it actually worked, then everything else just kind of falls in. Negotiation is also a power that you have no matter what. So no matter how impossible a situation is, you can always negotiate your way to make it more favorable, so try that. And then the great humanist, basically, Machiavelli, in English he basically said don't procrastinate. So that's absolutely true. If something has to be done, it has to be done eventually, just do it, right? Especially if it's time sensitive. The other thing I learned is how to sell, in the sense that not to go door to door and sell. I mean, as a technical guy, that's not something I'm going to do. But my mentor taught me that selling software is all about solving problems. So if you're not solving problems, you're not going to sell very much, right? So that's something important. Earning trust is actually very, very big. And also understanding and learning is things that you can bring back into your own technology as a product person and improve your product, whether you're selling, you make the sale or not, right? Okay, how to be really disruptive. Look at the story of the Gordian knot. This is Alexander the Great. So he was presented basically with a knot that couldn't be untied. So what do you think Alexander did? He cut it with a sword, right? Why? He's a disruptor. That's exactly it. He broke a rule that was not written. You can't break the rules that are written because you typically get in big trouble, right? But if you break the rules that aren't written, then you make your own rules and you still solve the problem. That's when you succeed as a disruptor. And one thing that really helped us at Virtual Bridges for the few customers that we were able to acquire is that our solution delivered more value at full price than our competitors, Citrix and VMware, did at full discount. Because we required way less hardware, way less skills to get the job done. So even if they gave their license away for free, you still have to buy twice as much hardware and have much more skill to do it. So that's a great litmus test for disruption, right? Okay, so that's it, pretty much on time. So my mentor taught me that when you're selling, you tell them, you repeat it to them, and you tell them again. So I keep mentioning my mentor, so please go find a mentor. Thank you.